Hello, ladies and gentlemen, Gabesty here. I'm back with some more Hearthstone goodies, and today a little something different. This is a deck guide, the first deck guide that I'm making. So feel free to give me some constructive criticism in the comments. Let me know if you found this useful, all that good stuff. And generally, this format will follow the format of my World of Warcraft guides, if you're familiar with those. So try to be a bit more detailed in what I'm giving you. So, this deck here is one I played this season, first time doing constructed season. It's a Shaman deck called Stopgap Slap. And I name it that because Stopgap, this deck tries to halt the pretty heavy aggression that you'll find in the current metagame, which is the most common style of deck you'll face. And then Slap, of course, refers to the ability for this deck to burst out some damage every once in a while and kind of slap the opponent down. So, as I said, the meta has Shaman kind of in the middle right now. You can see here like the most recent Liquid Hearth class power rankings, which are just a series of rankings that various professional streamers and whatnot put out for various class rankings. They put Shaman at an average of 5.3, with Warlock and Hunter clearly at the top, and Warrior and Druid a bit ahead. So Shaman's right in the middle there. So I think this deck did pretty well. As I said, I played it this season for the first time in Constructed, and I was able to get to Legendary all the way from 25 with about 125 wins. So it served me pretty well. And anyway, with that intro out of the way, we'll get into some specifics about the deck, go through the cards, talk about why they're there. We'll talk about some substitutions if you don't have particular cards you want to make subs, and we'll talk about various matchups and how you deal with those. So let's get started. All right, so basic description of this deck is primarily it's a control deck. For me, I'm not a big fan of the aggro style. I'm just not very good at it. I much prefer control. So this deck is primarily control, and a lot of it is very standard. A lot of cards you'll notice are standard for Shaman Constructed, but there are a few tweaks that are important. So I think the best thing is just to go through the deck here, talk about the cards and why they're in here. The first 6 cards, Earthshock, Lightning Bolt, and Rockbiter, are very standard removal cards for Shaman. And these are primarily used for dealing with what is common right now in the metagame, which is aggro. So Warlock Zoo decks are aggressive, Hunter decks are aggressive, and these are cheap removal options that allow you to deal with those. They also have some potential synergy with other cards in the deck, such as Pyromancer, where is it? And the Gadgetzan Auctioneer. There's also potential synergy with Rockbiter and Alakir. So, but those are the primary purpose of those 3. Stormforged Axe is similar. It's, again, to deal with sort of that early game aggro, because this deck tends to be fairly passive in the first few turns. So you need to have these removal options available to you to help you get into the mid and late game where you can actually drop your minions. Bloodmage Thalnos is not necessary, but he's quite useful at times. I basically play him as a form of on-demand spell damage. So oftentimes with the amount of removal you have, particularly with Lightning Bolt and Lightning Storm, you want to guarantee that something like Lightning Storm does a base of 3 damage, for example, or their Lightning Bolt does a base of 4 damage. So Thalnos will allow you to do that without losing your card advantage in the process. Flametongue Totem is also very useful for getting card advantage, but you have to have board control already, so I only have 1 of those in there because of that. Some people like 2, some people don't like them at all. I thought 1 was a pretty good balance. It can be used to great effect if you're able to play Feral Spirits, for example, on turn 3, and then the next turn on 4 you're overloaded for 2, so you have 2 mana. You can drop a Flametongue in between. And then, of course, other combinations with totems or other minions can allow them to be buffed up. Pyromancer is, in my opinion, quite critical for the current metagame. Again, primarily to deal with Warlock Zoo, but Hunters as well. Typically, the way that Hunter games go is that you don't actually clear their stuff very much until they get a lot of minions on the board, drawing a bunch of cards off them. But once the Hunter does that, most of their minions will be very low health, so Pyromancer can clean those up. Feral Spirits, pretty key card. It's tricky to play with the Overload, but getting used to playing this at the proper time is really important, holding back that aggro with the taunts. Hex is another critical card. It's just one of the best hard removals in the game. Very cheap in terms of mana, and great against control decks primarily. And even the current Hunter meta has Savannah High mains, which are great to hex. Lightning Storm is probably the most important card in this deck, again, based on the current meta. Drawing this or not drawing this can make or break your chance for victory in many cases, unfortunately. But that said, it's very powerful. So, and that will be discussed in the matchup section, but this is a critical card. So having 2 of this, 2 Hex, 2 Feral Spirit, I think that's all pretty much required. Mana Tide is another questionable choice, but it's kind of one of those cards that you never lose card advantage by playing it, so it's great in that sense. And if it's active for more than a turn, you get massive advantage. So if you have taunts already, and you play this around a turn where the opponent probably doesn't have spell or direct removal for this, and therefore they have to use minions, you probably get multiple draws off this. And even if you don't, it's basically spending 3 mana to cycle it out, and then the opponent will have to get rid of it somehow. Unbound Elemental, I tried the deck with and without these for a while, and ultimately found with them is better because of the number of overloads in the deck. Again, it can be tricky to play these, but these don't have overload innately. So the ideal is usually to play this on 3 or coin it on 2, and then follow it up with Feral Spirits the next turn. And you have a 3/5 Unbound and some taunts to protect it. 2 Defender of Argus, I think, are pretty important in this deck, again, based on the meta. If aggro wasn't as prevalent, I would probably drop these for something else. And again, I tried with none of these and 1 of these and ended up with 2 as I got higher in the ranks, because it felt more important to have more taunts, and the ability to buff things like your totems that otherwise would be stationary is really critical. So allowing a 0/2 totem to be a 1/3 is not a lot of potential damage, but it's enough to put pressure on and allow you to trade favorably and all that. Sen'jin is another critical card. This can be punished pretty severely in some situations where the opponent plays a Black Knight, but that's not that common. I'll talk about in the matchup where you see that mostly. But otherwise, it's really a great card on 4 to stopping that heavy aggression that you'll see. Azure Drake, another critical card. So I got 2 more of those. These are just some of the best 5s you can really get. Probably the best 5 in terms of minions. Spell damage can be great. If you're playing this beyond turn 5, you can use it with something like a Lightning Bolt or an Earthshock. And often Earthshock for 2 or Lightning Bolt for 4 is a difference between winning and losing. So it's a great card. Auctioneer is another very useful card. Sometimes you can't get the most value that you want out of him, but when you can, you have so many cheap spells that you can cycle these out, even if you're not playing them quite ideally, and get tons of value out of the card draw. Harrison Jones is another card I played with and without, and found it was pretty good for the current meta, but I'll talk about that in the matchup section. But basically the idea here is, of course, weapon removal and card advantage. If you don't have access to this or you want a lower card, you can go for Ooze or something. Fire Elemental, 2 of those are pretty obvious. Some of the best common minions in the game, very powerful late game. And then Alakir is a final late game card, potential finisher, and he's another form of taunt if you're desperate for stopping damage income. All right, let's talk about substitutions. So, a couple cards you may want to substitute or might have to. Blood Mage Thalnos, excuse me. Obviously a legendary. If you don't have him or you don't like him, I would suggest substituting him for another Manatide Totem, perhaps, because it will replace the card draw that he has for Death Rattle at the cost of 1 more mana. The spell damage is tough to replace with a good card, so if you don't want to do Manatide and you're looking for a removal, then I would probably go with a Forked Lightning in his slot. And this will just be a nice way to deal with that aggro for cheap initial mana cost. And potentially you can do a totem for 2 plus a Forked Lightning for 3 total mana initially. If you get the spell damage totem, it'll be great. So yeah, that'd be the sub for Blood Mage. Another possible substitution is Harrison Jones. If you are facing very few, if any, weapon users, I would just take him out altogether and put in a pretty decent card in his place. Knife Juggler would be pretty good consideration because this deck lacks early game minions, so he's really good for Shaman. Another possibility is, if you are facing weapon users but you don't have one, is just, of course, the Acidic Swamp Ooze. Would be a great sub. And for me, I wasn't facing that many weapon users, but it was common enough that even if I only drew 1 card off this and got rid of their weapon, that's pretty amazing value. So that's why I threw him in there. And then Alakir, another possible sub. In this case, it's pretty difficult to replace him. His main purpose is that synergy with Rockbiter Weapon, as well as the Taunt and Divine Shield. So at worst, you're trading a Rockbiter Weapon for a minion of the opponent's up to 6 health, which you don't see very much above that. And you have a 3/5, Wind Fury Taunt guy active. So I think the best replacement would probably be Leroy if you have him, but he's another legendary. Or Ragnaros, another legendary. If you don't have those, Argent Commander would be pretty good. It's very low damage, but it does have the Charged Divine Shield factor that Alakir also has. So you could use both of these to effectively get rid of something. He can also be used with the Rockbiter. And the other possibility is a Bloodlust. There are a number of times with this deck where I have quite a bit on the board, but I just don't have much finishing power. So this would enable your totems and other weak minions that you can't really do much with, especially stuff that's totems that are Argus that are kind of low to begin with. These could be enabled to do a lot of heavy damage. This may be a dead card in your hand at times, but it's a pretty good option there for replacement. Everything else should be pretty much available to everyone that's considering this deck. I think the rares are pretty much all required, so I wouldn't... Maybe the Arguses you could skip, but the rest are pretty important, I think. All right, let's talk a bit about the matchups that you'll face. These are all basically what's most popular or common right now in the current meta as of the time of this recording. So obviously this could change, and feel free to comment if you have any questions or whatever. So here you can see the rough list. I've made 5 different delineations for the decks that you'll face and how this particular Shaman deck goes up against them, ranging from the opponent being heavily favored at the top down to you as a player, as a Shaman, being heavily favored at the bottom. So I've left out a few classes that you just don't see very much, Paladin and Mage, stuff like that. But other than that, we'll just go through these and talk about them and kind of how you mulligan and how you play against these decks. So the first step, we have the opponent heavily favored, and we'll start with Priest Control. So you don't see Priest very often, but when you do, it's almost invariably this deck, which is based around the idea of Circle of Healing, with the Akanai Soul Priest. So if you're not aware, whoops, I can't look at there. Akanai Soul Priest converts cards and powers that restore health and damage. So the opponent will play that, plus a Circle of Healing for 0 cost, which instead of restoring 4 health to all minions, does 4 damage to all minions. So this effectively is a 4 damage board clear for 4 mana. Their Akanai Soul Priest will take 4, but it will survive with 1 health. So usually they'll play this when you have a lot of stuff on the board. And the problem with that is, against a Shaman, it's a very cheap and effective way to clear out a lot of your stuff. So all your totems, of course, all your early game minions, a lot of your mid-game minions, unless your unbounds have been buffed a bit. Your Senjins survive, your Drakes die, your Auctioneer dies, your Harrison dies. So, best case is you have a few 5 health minions that might survive a bit. In addition to that, they will have 2 more board clears in the form of Holy Nova, which, again, are pretty effective. 2 damage this time, but again, that takes care of your totems innately. So 4 potential board clears, and then the priest will focus on card advantage and keeping your board clear until they get to the late game. Once they reach the late game, they'll play large minions like Ysera, Ragnaros, Karen probably, and then of course Thoughtsteal twice. They'll probably Faceless Manipulator, copy your guy. They have a lot of healing. They have Shadow Word removals, so it's a very difficult matchup. The best way to mulligan against this, I've found, is to try to plan for them to drop a Northshire Cleric early. So you want to try to get one of your removals. Ideally, you want to use a Rockbiter instead of a Lightning Bolt, because Lightning Bolt will overload you. Plus, Lightning Bolt can be used with spell damage later on if you need it. The other really difficult thing to deal with is the injured Blade Master, because they'll almost always play this the same turn that they can heal it, either with a Circle of Healing to 4/7 on turn 3, or on turn 5 or later where they can heal it manually up to a 4/5. And dealing with a 5 health minion with this Shaman deck is actually quite a challenge. And if you don't kill it immediately, they'll keep healing it. So you'll have to utilize a combination of Pyro plus spells, or Flame Tongue plus minions. The problem is you do not want to hex the injured Blade Master, and that's tough to do. Sometimes it just gets out of control and you're forced to do it. But if you do that, it means you're down one of your hard removals, and that means you cannot deal with one of the late game legendaries, Ysera, Rag, whatever. So try not to hex early game. Other than that, the basic play style is clear their board all the time. Don't let them keep anything on the board for a turn, because they'll buff it or heal it, and you'll get down on board control. And then try to always be thinking about when the board clears can happen and what they will do. So if you can keep your minions at 3 or more health, you'll avoid Holy Nova, and if you can keep them at 5 or more health, you'll avoid the Soul Priest Circle of Healing combo. And those are key values. So it's a pretty tough matchup, but that's the best you can do there. All right, the second matchup I think the opponent is heavily favored is Warlock Control, better known as Handlock. And these decks all revolve around huge minions. So the main issues are the potential for 5 or more 8/8 minions between the 4 giants plus Alexstrasza. Alexstrasza there, and then Molten Giant and Mountain Giant. So you'll see over the course of the game, if it reaches that far, you'll see 5 8/8 or higher minions. And for this deck, the Shaman deck, it's really difficult to deal with those. Basically, you have 2 hexes. So there was a time in my climb up with this deck, I was facing Handlock a lot, and I actually swapped in a big game hunter just to deal with that. So if you face Handlock a lot, where the current ranking that you're at or whatever, I would suggest swapping a big game hunter temporarily into your deck. You could probably swap out Harrison Jones if you're not facing a lot of weapons, or one of the defenders of Argus if needed. And that will give you 3 outs, so to speak, against the Handlock, 2 hexes in a big game. Still, there's a lot of stuff besides that. There's those 5/8/8s, plus you'll face Twilight Drakes, which will generally be 4/7, 4/8, or higher. So you have to get Earthshock to deal with those. And why is this not working? There we go. You need Earthshock to deal with Twilight Drakes, absolutely. It will be 1 mana and a 1-for-1 trade, which is great for you. But if you don't have it, those early game Twilight Drakes will be devastating. And then the other main thing is that they get sort of a free pseudo heal plus Lord Jaraxxus, which gives them a massive weapon as well as a heal up to 15 and pretty much free 6/6 minions from their hero power. So in my opinion, this deck is the least favored against Handlock of all the opponents you'll face. That was the one I've found the most trouble with by far. They're not that common compared to Aggro, but they're still out there. So be aware of that. A few tips for dealing with this, or actually for mulliganing first. Always try to get an Earthshock. The problem is against a Warlock, you don't really know if it's a Handlock or Aggro. Most Warlocks these days are Aggro. So you have to plan for both of those, which is one of the problems. But if you have an Earthshock, you can keep one of those. Another useful thing is Hex. If you're confident that it is a Handlock, Hex for that turn 4 Mountain Giant is crucial. And you can also go for a Mana Tide, if you think it's Handlock, to get that card advantage back that you'll lose. Otherwise, you'll basically have to plan for Earthshock and or Hex, and then Lightning Storm if possible, because you'll have to assume it's actually Aggro Lock as well as Handlock. So pretty tough to do against a Warlock to get all those bases covered in your opening mulligan there. So another thing to keep in mind about this matchup is that Hellfire is always a possibility, so really keep in mind what Hellfire could do to your board state at any given time. The opponent will not be shy to damage themselves throughout this matchup because they want to cast Molten Giants for cheap or free. So always consider, if Hellfire hits for 3 damage, what is it going to do to your board? You also pretty much want to always be aggressive if possible. So try to do your opening plays based around the assumption that the opponent will not have time to get through all of their cards and play out everything that they can. If you try to play too passively against Handlock, they will eventually get through all their cards, play out all 5 of their big minions, get low health, play Jaraxxus, do even more crazy stuff, and you just won't be able to keep up because you don't have that much removal between your hexes and stuff. So I found it best against Handlock to play aggressively. That's not to say don't think about when you push them below 15 health or so, because they will be able to play Molten Giants for close to free. 15 health would mean a Molten Giant costs 5. So if you get them below 15 or so, they may have 2 Molten Giants in hand. They'll be able to play that turn plus a Taunt Giver, and that will be pretty devastating for you. So if possible, get them around 15, then set up for a 1-turn kill the next turn, but that's tricky to do. And then finally, just try to maintain board control, and of course use Hex and other removals as efficiently as possible until you're ready for that killing blow. But like I said, this is a really difficult matchup. So sometimes you just won't be able to deal with the Handlock, and just re-queue and you'll most likely get another opponent. They're not that common, thankfully. All right, next up for our opponents that are slightly favored, and of course, anything that I have marked in slightly or even matchup is up for debate, but this is just my opinion based on my experience. So first up, we have the Druid Aggro, or Token Druid, as it's better known. And Token Druids are slightly favored because of their burst potential. That's the best way I can describe it. In terms of one-for-one trades, usually you can be pretty much even with them or even get an upper hand in some cases, but they will slowly wear you down. And without innate healing like the Druid has through their hero power and armor gains, eventually your health will start to dwindle. And the main issue against a token Druid is the possibility of a Savage Roar, which you're probably familiar with. Oops. Savage Roar giving all their characters to attack for the turn, plus other possible combination cards. And this means that once your health reaches a pretty low level, 15 or below, you're basically in lethal range at any given time, even if their board is clear. So that's the main difficulty with this opponent. It's not really that you can't control them better than they can control you. It's just you will get dwindled. So, mulliganing against the token Druid, and again, you don't really know when you're first going against the Druid whether it's token or not. Kind of like the Warlock problem. You have to assume it's either a control Druid or a token Druid and kind of mulligan, or you can mulligan for both. But anyway, if you think it's token, Earthshock is great for things like Harvest Golem. Thalnos they'll also play often, and Imp Master is another common one. So Earthshock on any of those is pretty good early game. It doesn't innately kill some of the cards. In fact, none of them except Thalnos, but preventing them from getting those little weaker minions is crucial. You'll also want to try to get Lightning Bolt or Stormforged Axe, again for those early removals. Mana Tide Totem is good for early card advantage. Feral Spirit with Flame Tongue, if you have that combination, is great for early game protection. Wild Pyro can be useful for clearing those weaker minions. And then, of course, Lightning Storm, again, assuming you know it's token Druid. So basically, you're trying to look for the cheap early game removal or cheap taunts. General tips, similar to the Priest matchup, if you leave anything on the board against token Druid, it will probably not end in your favor. So always clear their stuff. And if you can keep doing that long enough, eventually you'll take over control of the game and they will have weaker stuff. They won't be able to buff it enough. In this token Druid matchup, they generally don't play very big minions. So your best bet for Hex is usually a Violet Teacher, which is a crucial summoning card for them to summon more tokens, or maybe an Ancient of Lore. So let's take a quick look at these. Violet Teacher, of course, summons a 1/1 token when they cast a spell. And then the Ancient of Lore is usually the biggest in terms of health creature that they'll have, which will draw them cards, of course, at the same time. But a 5/5 that doesn't do anything after it's cast is not quite as scary as the Violet Teacher in many cases. So don't be afraid to hex either one of those in this matchup. And you should know pretty early on, once the opponent has played a few minions, if you see stuff like Harvest Golem, Imp Master, you should know it's token Druid pretty quickly. You also want to play around Swipe. This always goes for Druid matchups, but this one just the same. So count how many times Swipe has been used, and if they have used it only once, always expect another one that's possible. It only does one side damage, so if you can protect some of your weaker minions with taunts, then you can force them to use Swipe on the untaunted minion if they want to kill it directly. And then the swipe damage will be pretty incidental, or vice versa. And let's see. If you have dominant board control, eventually the game will be all but won. So, as I said, the focus is killing everything that they have, and eventually you will gain card advantage because their general cards are weaker than yours, especially once you get to the late game. And once you can take advantage of things like Ascension, Defender, Azure Drake, Fire Elemental especially, you will get advantage on the board, and they will not be able to get strong enough minions to deal with your stuff. All right, the next matchup that is one of the more common that you'll see right now in the current meta is against Aggro Hunter. And this is a style that uses weapons and traps, which is sort of the standard Aggro Hunter that you're used to. So the main goal of that deck is to slowly whittle you down with their hero power and use the Hunter's secrets, these traps, to either clear your board or just remove your minions with freezing trap, make them, slow down your basic play style, or use misdirection to force your attacks on them to actually go to your face in most cases if they don't have any minions out. And meanwhile, they're playing a weapon. I forget what it's called. Yeah, Eaglehorn Bow. And gaining durability every time one of their traps procs. So they'll be doing damage to you with the weapon over, every turn. And eventually, if you summon too many minions, they'll use the infamous Unleash the Hounds, summoning a 1/1 charge beast, along with a starving buzzard. So this is the crucial combination for pretty much all Hunter decks. But in this case, because they've been whittling you down and delaying your control of the board, when this happens, they gain back all the card advantage that they spent, basically. So the main trick to playing around this is playing around the Unleash the Hounds. And this is why the opponent is slightly favored, because every minion you summon, including totems, gives another Unleash summon. And when they have the buzzard beforehand, that means they get an extra card compared to your totem, which was not a card, it's just a totem, So you spent 2 mana, got a totem, and they get a card out of it when they do that combination. So you really have to play around the number of minions that you have on the board against a Hunter, and this deck in particular. Try to keep your number of minions to 2 or 3 at most if possible against Hunters. If you get 4 or more minions, they'll do that combination and draw so many cards that even if you were ahead, you probably won't be able to recover without some critical mistakes on their part, or just terrible luck. So keeping your minion count down is the key. Sometimes this even means not summoning a totem, especially early on. If you don't have any good reason to do so, like a follow-up play, you may even be better off skipping turn 2 if you don't have anything to do, rather than summoning a totem, which will give them an extra card on turn 4 or later, almost guaranteed. Always consider the traps and play around them properly. So you should not be afraid to make a list. Why didn't this come up? Trap. There we go. Don't be afraid to have a list handy while you're playing against Hunters and whatnot. And just take a look at the wording in particular. It's really important that you know when something like Freezing Trap will trigger. It's whenever your minion attacks, not just when you attack the opponent's hero. Or something like Explosive or Misdirect is based on when you attack the hero. So, knowing those things are critical. And always you want to play around the potential trap. Consider what trap the opponent is most benefited by in the current situation if they play one. Test for that trap as best you can, and if it's not that, then you can disprove it or prove it is something else. Now, generally the Hunter will be fairly aggressive, but they must draw a lot of cards off the buzzards to get a big advantage. So if you limit that draw, as I mentioned, keeping your minion count low, eventually you will wear them down. However, you could take quite a bit of damage in the process. Against the aggro style that has weapons and traps, your Hex generally be fine to use on a pretty weak minion. So an Animal Companion Summon or an Arcane Golem. If you're confident it's that style of Hunter deck, not the Beast style, which we'll talk about later, then that's your best target for Hex. They probably won't play anything more dangerous than that. So like the 4/4 Animal Companion or even a 4/2 charge is good enough. Yeah. So I think those are the general tips for dealing with the weapon trap hunter. And I didn't talk about mulliganing. You want to mulligan for Earthshock for cheap non-overload removal of 1-drops if they have any. Stormforge Axe is also good for early game removal. They won't have any, probably won't have any weapon removal of their own because they focus on beasts, and oozes are not beasts. Lightning Storm is great. Obviously, you probably won't play this until after they get all their card advantage, but once they have a board full of all these 1 health or 2 health minions, Lightning Storm will clear everything really easily. And then if you do have a Harrison Jones or an Ooze in your deck because you're facing weapon users like the Hunters, trying to save that in your opening hand when you mulligan is great. All right, and then the final matchup for sort of opponents slightly being favored is the Warlock, Aggro, or Zoo deck, which, again, is one of the most popular right now in the current meta. And the main issue with this deck is that the board is quickly overrun by the Warlock, and it can be very difficult to maintain your own minions when the opponent can get favorable trades with pretty cheap combinations. So some of the cards are Soulfire, which of course got 0, just they discard a card. Argent Squire is a common card in that deck with the Divine Shield, and then they'll combine that with buff cards. So any of the cheaper minions that give plus attack can allow the Argent Squire to trade up very favorably. They'll also use Mortal Coil to kill off anything with 1 health and draw a card back. Doomguard is probably the scariest card that you'll face. Very devastating when they play this on turn 5, and they get a 5/7 charge. And so this matchup is really one of those very reliant on Lightning Storm. And it's basically the ability for you to win or lose almost invariably comes down to whether you get a board clear like Lightning Storm. You don't necessarily need it to win, but you need some combination of removals like Lightning Storm. Lightning Storm is the best. So mulligan for this matchup. You want cheap removals, of course. So Earthshock is great. You can take care of the Divine Shield, Argent Squire, the same turn, on turn 1 basically. Lightning Bolt's fine. Rockbiter's also fine. Axe is great. Pyromancer is great. You'll want to save him until after turn 2 so that you can use him in combination with some other spell and or the coin. So you get the ability to clear the board with Pyro and other spells instead of Lightning Storm. Lightning Storm, of course, is crucial. So if you can get that in your opening hand, that's great. Otherwise, taunts are critical. So Feral Spirit, Sen'jin, if you can, and Defender of Argus in a pinch if you don't get either of those others. So general tips, try to maintain your health levels early game using these cheap removals so you can set up for an efficient Lightning Storm. If you don't keep your health high enough, it doesn't matter if you do eventually get that board clear, because it'll be so low they can just ignore your stuff and they'll draw into 10 potential damage from Doomguard. You know, the charge 5/7. And I don't know why I'm showing you. You've seen it already. And 2 Soulfires, so 8 more damage from those. They'll also get buff damage, so even if they don't get the charge minions, stuff that you see on the board will actually do more damage than you think. So it can be very difficult to survive against that onslaught. Thalnos or Spell Damage Totem can be crucial to allow your Lightning Storm or your Forked Lightning, if you throw it in there, if you're facing this deck a lot, to sort of clean up everything. You want to count the number of critical cards the opponent has played. So count the number of Doomfires in particular, or Doomguards rather, and the number of Soulfires. and keep track of those 2 cards in particular. Once you've counted, 2 of any particular one of those, you can play with confidence knowing that they can't do that again, and that is crucial. Doomguard, probably even more important than Soulfire, because Soulfire you don't know what they'll use it on, but Doomguard is very difficult to deal with. Because of the Doomguard trickery, if you're facing a Zoo deck, Hex has to be used on Doomguard. There are very, very few situations where you'll want to Hex something else. It's possible, but most of the time I found Hex saved for Doomguard is the best case. Usually this means the Doomguard gets 2 for 1 because it charges out, kills one of your things, and then has however much health remaining. But unless you can remove it with something like a lightning bolt that doesn't force you to take damage, then Hex is your next best option. Another thing to do is try to cycle through your deck as quickly as possible to draw into your board clear cards. So you want to get into Lightning Storm quickly if possible. So if your opening hand has something like Thalnos, and you don't have spells that can make use of his spell damage, you may want to drop him early to have his Death Rattle go off and cycle him out. Same thing for Manatee Totem, or even Azure Drake. Put these cards out quickly if you don't have better options, so that you at least draw something deeper into your deck and try to get that board clear quickly before it's too late. All that said, if you sustain control of the board, eventually the opponent will run out of steam because this deck is very low cost. So while the opponent will be playing 2 cards every turn, they'll be weak cards. So once the Warlock gets to a top deck situation, outside of some extremely lucky Doomguard draws, you will have the game pretty well locked down. The key, once you get to that point, is keeping your taunts active so that any charges that they do top deck cannot kill you outright, and they have to hit your taunt. All right, so on to the even matches here. First, we begin with Druid Control, known as the Watcher or Ramp Druid. These are slightly different decks, but they're basically played out the same from your perspective. So general issues against this deck is that Innervates and or a coin early on into some big minion like a Yeti or a Druid of the Claw can be quite problematic. So if you're not aware, Innervate gives 2 mana crystals for the turn that they play it. So that is 2 plus a coin, could be 3 on top of whatever they have, so they can get a big minion out on turn 1 or 2, which is very difficult for the Shaman to deal with. Ancient Watchers are also very common in this deck, hence why it's called a Watcher Druid in most cases. So while they cannot attack innately, these can be problematic because if this is played on turn 2 and the Druid goes second, they can coin out a Keeper of the Grove to silence it on turn 3. So turn 3, the turn it can attack first. When it's silenced, you have a 4 or 5 Ancient Watcher to deal with, which is pretty difficult. Also, they'll often use Sunfury Protector, which doesn't allow it to attack, but they'll give it taunt. So if they coin out an Ancient Watcher on turn 1, you can expect a Sunfury to come out on turn 2 to give it taunt. And again, that's very difficult to deal with. Ancient of Lore is pretty much a go-to card for Druids. This one just gives a lot of card advantage, so that can be difficult to deal with. And then Savage Roar, just like the Token Druid, is very possible in the Watcher Druid. Not so much ramp, but you still need to be aware of this possibility, that the combo of Savage Roar and what the hell is it called? I can't think. Force of Nature. Sorry. That combination is always possible. And then the other major issue is the Black Knight. This card is almost always included in Druid decks, primarily to deal with mirror matches, but it fits in nicely with the curve. And for our deck that is so taunt heavy, because of the metagame being so aggro dependent, this is a pretty devastating card to deal with. So, mulliganing against this deck. Generally, you want to try to get a Hex in your opening hand so that you can deal with an innervated big minion if they do play one. If you don't have a Hex, you need some multiple removal. So some combination of 2 removals early game. The best case would be like an Axe plus a Rockbiter or a Lightning Bolt, so that at least you're not wasting the entirety of the Axe to deal with it. But often you just have to Hex that innervated minion. You'll also want to look for Feral Spirits to get some early game minions out. If you can get a Feral Spirit in your opening hand plus a combination with Flame Tongue or Argus or Unbound Elemental, that'll be really good. And then Lightning Bolt in particular is early removal. That's great against this matchup because it gets around an Ancient Watcher that has Taunt. So even though the Taunt will be sitting there, you can use a spell, of course, to get around it, whereas you can't use a Rockbiter to get around it. General tips for this matchup. You want to fight very hard for board control and always clear the opponent's board. Similar to other Druid matchups and Priest and all that good stuff. That's really the key, is keeping their board clear, because it's a pretty slow deck overall, but it has a potential for burst. As I said, if you don't need the Hex early game for that innervated dude, try to save it for big legendaries at the end. Cairn is pretty common, Cenarius, sometimes Ragnaros, and try to save it for those. But if the game is going to be lost because you don't Hex something before then, don't be afraid to use it on a pretty big minion, especially a buffed, Druid of the Claw or Yeti or something like that. You want to be a little bit wary of your own health. Once you get around 15 health, that's the getting close to the Savage Roar Force of Nature range, which is 14 damage by itself. You want to try to take advantage of your own taunts to counter the Druid's hero power. So because they have to obey taunt rules when using their hero power, even if your minions are at 1 health, if they're behind a taunt, you're generally pretty safe. That doesn't account for swipe damage, of course, but if you have, like a healing totem and a taunt minion with 2 or more health protecting it, it's great. And then lastly, try to save your Rockbiter weapons, if possible, for the end game with Alakir if you have him in your deck, or other big minions if you have them, Argent Commander if you have that charge possibility, so that you can get some potential finishers in there. All right, on to the matchups that I think are slightly favored for the Shaman. First, we have the Hunter Control Beast or the No Weapons Traps deck. And this is actually pretty new, made very popular recently by Colento, who is a great player and really enjoyable to watch stream, I might say. He's got a cool accent too. But anyway, he made this deck extremely popular by getting rank 1 in North America recently, and suddenly the next day or within hours, it was just the deck you would face. Like, I can't tell you how many times I played that deck. So the reason that this deck is interesting is because it doesn't use weapons or traps like the normal control hunter does. So instead, it focuses on beast synergies, more so than even other hunters, and throws in interesting cards like King Mukla, or Mukla, however you say it. I can't type. Who's also a beast and, a pretty strong minion early game and all that stuff. And then it uses Houndmasters to give beasts extra stats, and Savannah Highmane for a really good late game minion, all that good stuff. Anyway, so main issues for this deck is just like the other Hunter matchups, the combination of Starving Buzzard plus Unleash the Hounds, primarily the Unleash part, is devastating against a Shaman, since your hero power will, again, draw them an extra card if they have the Buzzard when they play the Unleashed. So, other than that, Hunter's Mark for 0 cost, in combination with an Unleash charge guy, is a great way to deal with your big threats, like Fire Elemental, Azure Drake, Sinjin, stuff like that. So it's kind of difficult to avoid that. You want to try to keep track of that kind of stuff. Hyenas, Scavenging Hyenas can be very dangerous if they're allowed to buff up a bit. So if they get out of control, you really need to deal with them immediately or silence them in some way. And then Savannah High Mains, as mentioned, can be problematic if you don't have removal for them. So mulliganing against this beast deck, or no weapon, no trap deck, you basically want multiple early removals in case of a coined Mukla. So again, I talked about this in other matchups. For 5 damage, the best combination of multiple removals is an axe plus one of these 3 damage removals. You have 4 of them, but the axe, of course, is tough to come by. The other option, of course, is to have a minion already on the board and then use the minion plus removal. But in that situation, you would already have a minion to buff with the bananas. I don't think I can look at bananas here, but no, I can't. But anyway, Mukla gives you 2 banana cards, which are 1 mana cost, and they give a minion 1 health and 1 attack, 1 damage. But if you don't have anything on the board, which is usually the case when this is played, it can be tough to take advantage of that. So try to mulligan into removals in case of that early game Mukla that you should expect. Again, assuming you can properly assume that the hunter is this kind of deck, which most of the time they will be these days. You also want to try to get a wild pyromancer if you can. This can be great for cleaning up the board after an Unleash the Hounds play. So you don't really need it on the board. You just want to have it in your hand so that you can use it plus a coin or another spell to clear all those 1 health minions if they did unleash. And then other than that, just try to mulligan into taunts so you can stop damage as quickly as possible. Feral Spirits, Arius, Sinjin, all that good stuff. General tips for this matchup. Always be thinking about, as usual against a hunter, the possibility of Unleash the Hounds. So do not be afraid to hold back on totem summons in particular in favor of minions that can actively do something for you. Try to count the number of Unleash the Hounds throughout the game that have been used. So if fewer than 2 have been played, you can expect 1 at any time. You want to try to keep your minion count at 3 or below, similar to other hunter matchups. You can also kind of cheat a bit, even if you haven't counted 2 Unleash the Hounds that have been played. You can instead count the number of buzzards. And if both buzzards have been played, then you can kind of get away with playing more than 3 minions, because even if the opponent uses an Unleash and gets more than 3 hounds out of it, while it's not great for you, at least they won't get card draw, since the buzzard's the only way to draw off those. So you can kind of cheat in that way, but counting the Unleash and the buzzard plays is really important. I would also beware of playing any single large minion, such as your Fire Elemental or your Senjin, as the only minion you have on your side of the board, particularly if they have something already active. Because this deck usually has 2 kill commands, and these do 5 damage if there's a beast out, which can deal with the Fire Elemental and the Sinjin, and they also generally run a Deadly Shot or 2, which just outright kills a random enemy minion. But if you only have 1 on the board, that is a prime target. So try to get multiple minions if you're going to play one of your big guys like that. Always save Hex for the Savannah Highmane. This is the target to Hex in this matchup. There are 2 Savannah Highmanes, and you have 2 Hexes. So that's it. You really try not to use Hex on anything else. If you're absolutely desperate and somehow the opponent gets a hyena that's out of control early game, you're facing an 8 attack hyena or some craziness, you can in a pinch swap the Hex and the Earth Shocks, basically. So in that case, you could Hex the hyena if you have it in your hand, and then try to use an Earth Shock on a Savannah Highmane later on if you get one of those against you. But Hex is definitely better against the Savannah Highmane, since even an Earth Shocked Highmane is still a 6/4 at best. And then finally, keep your taunt count high, and try to deal with the big threats as they come in, like the Highmanes and the hyenas. And eventually, you will establish control because the hunter will lose steam. Once they run out of their card draw mechanics, their buzzards and their unleashed in particular, and have played out their big minions like Savannah Highmane, that's pretty much it. So you will eventually take the game, and you have about 11 potential taunts in this deck. So you should be able to hold on if you play out your taunts properly. So the next deck that you'll face a fair bit that I think the Shaman is slightly favored against is the Miracle Rogue. Most rogues that you'll face these days are Miracle style, and Miracle Rogues basically have a deck that revolves around massive card draw to lead into a very buffed up Edwin Van Cleef, who I don't actually have, or just to draw into the combination that will allow them to kill you basically in one turn. So the main issue is, in my opinion, Leroy Jenkins. And without going into a rant, I would argue that Leroy Jenkins is an issue on his own in many, many decks. But this is the main card that will be a problem and a potential issue for you. The reason is that in the rogue's hands, with cards like Shadow Step, Leroy can be played and therefore attacked because of charge multiple times in the same turn. So it's very easy for the rogue to have potential lethal pretty early in the game, depending on how lucky they were with their draws. And that's the general goal, is to try to draw all their cards quickly and get into these combinations. So for example, a Leroy with 6 damage on his charge with 2 Shadow Steps is 18 total damage from an empty board for 8 mana. If the opponent has 2 Cold Bloods, and they play it properly, then they can do 26 damage with a Leroy, 2 Shadow Steps, and 2 Cold Bloods for 10 mana. So virtually, you could be almost full health, and you could die on turn 10 if they had all the right cards. And arguably even before that with stuff like Preparation. But, these are all really unlikely. It's just possible. So that's the main issue facing this opponent. The other thing is that the Auctioneer, which is critical to this deck for the card draw, allows them to cycle through their cards quickly, so they can get to those Leroy combinations and potentially have lethal on you faster than would otherwise be possible. So facing this deck, you generally want to mulligan for 1 early removal, if possible, the 3 damage removals, Lightning Bolt or Rockbiter, for a coined out SI7 agent. So the SI7 is pretty much their only early game minion, but it's great against a turn 2 totem play, which is typically what you'll do with the Shaman deck, because if they combo it, they get to kill the totem off and get a 3/3 on the board. So having a 3 damage removal is really helpful against that. You also want taunts. So again, typical taunts: Feral Spirits, Argus, and Sinjin, all very useful early game to hold off that aggression. And just keep your health totals as high as possible. And then finally try to mulligan into, if you have a weapon removal, Harrison Jones or the Ooze, which should be used for deadly poisoned weapon charge. Try not to use it on just a regular 1 damage weapon charge. Even Harrison Jones, which will draw you a card, is usually better spent on the deadly poisoned weapon charge. So, general tips for this matchup. Once you reach about 20 health or lower, as mentioned, you're in potential lethal range. So that doesn't take much to get to. If you can also kind of pick up on some hints from the opponent's playstyle. If you have minions on the board that are sort of threatening, but not really taunts, and they're using eviscerates on you directly in some early turns, comboing them, doing 4 damage to your face, it's a pretty clear indicator that they have most, if not all, of the Leroy combo in their hand. And you should expect that to come out anytime. So As I said, if your health gets low or they're kind of playing aggressively like that, then try to get your taunts out and keep them active so that you can prevent that Leroy from coming in. The other thing to keep in mind is that most of the removal cards for Rogue are slow, such as Sap. So these are just slow mechanics that return the minion to your hand, but they don't actually kill it, or they're limited. So Blade Flurry is their only real board clear, and typically what they'll do is Deadly Poison their weapon, and then Blade Flurry for 3, sometimes attacking first if they have to get a big minion lower, and then try to clear your board. So Blade Flurry with a Deadly Poison will kill a lot of your stuff, since your totems only have 2 health usually, even with Argus up to 3. However, stuff like Blade Flurry, Fan of Knives, Eviscerate, these are all limited. Of course, they can only have 2 of these. So once they get through them, that's kind of it. And that's sort of the key. So the more stuff you can flood on the board, generally speaking, the more difficult it will be for the opponent to deal with it. Unless everything is super weak, and then they can not Fan of Knives, but Blade Flurry, or maybe Fan of Knives and kill it. But usually the more stuff you have, the better. Try to get out your big minions quickly, so the 5 health minions in particular, which require more than an Eviscerate to deal with directly. So if you can get your Fire Elementals out on turn 5 with a coin or 6, Senjin, like an Argus Unbound Elemental up to 5 health, anything that has 5 or more requires multiple sources of damage for the rogue to deal with. Even if it's just a dagger attack plus an Eviscerate, and still a 1-for-1 for them, they had to take some damage to do it. And they usually have to spend some mana on their weapon at some point, so that's advantage for you. Count the number of key cards that they use. And this is going to be tough to do because there are a lot of cards being played pretty quickly. But important ones are Blade Flurry. They usually only have 1 of those. Eviscerate, Shadow Step, as mentioned, is a really crucial one because of the Leroy combinations. And Backstab, of course, which in combination with Eviscerate can deal with your bigger minions. Once you've seen Shadow Step used on something that's not Leroy, even just 1 of them, that should give you a lot of breathing room, because suddenly Leroy with a Shadow Step is only down to 12 damage, which is still a lot, and then there's Cold Bloods and all that stuff, but it's significant. So if they have to use a Shadow Step on something else, usually that's incorrect, but sometimes they'll do it on Auctioneer or something to save it, and that's good for you in most cases. And then finally, speaking of the Auctioneer, try to save a Lightning Bolt with spell damage if you have something like Thalnos or just a spell damage totem that you can easily get out. Try to save a Lightning Bolt for a Auctioneer that has 4 health. If you have spell damage, it'll be a 4 damage Lightning Bolt. And if you don't have a Lightning Bolt and they conceal the Auctioneer, which is typical, you can try to use spell damaged Lightning Storm. But even with 1 spell damage, you have a 50% chance since it's 3 to 4 damage. So that's not a great thing to rely on. But it's a possibility. The main issue is if you allow an Auctioneer to be active for an extra turn, basically they play it and then you don't deal with it the next turn that you have, you'll probably lose too much card advantage and tempo to come back into the game. So try to deal with the Auctioneer immediately if possible. And if you do that, you should be able to sustain control of the game, because the opponent will take quite a bit of damage using their weapon throughout the game and won't be able to make favorable trades once you reach the late game. And you have enough taunts that you should be able to hold them off as long as they don't get into that Leroy Shadow Step stuff too quickly. All right, and then the last matchup that's pretty common is, in my opinion, very heavily favored for the Shaman, and that's Warrior Control. So some potential issues that you may face against this opponent: their early game minions are kind of a pain in the ass to deal with. So typically you'll see stuff like Armorsmith, which has 4 health, and Frothing Berserker, which also has 4 health. So those are typically the early game minions that you'll see. Sometimes Cruel Taskmaster, but that's usually after a combination, or an Acolyte of Pain. And the Acolyte, of course, even though it has 3 health, it's going to draw cards, so you can remove it, but it doesn't give you much advantage. So that's kind of the main problem. Early game minions are kind of a pain to deal with, because you typically do 3 damage as a shaman, not 4. The other issue is that Shield Slam, dealing 1 damage for every armor the opponent has, along with Execute, or not even in conjunction with, but basically they'll have 2 Executes and 2 Shield Slams typically. So they have 4 pretty reliable removals, which can deal with your big minions quite easily. So Sinjin, Fire Elemental, Unbound Elemental, Auctioneer, stuff like that can get easily removed by those cards. Brawl is also typically found in this deck, usually 1 of them, and this will destroy all minions except 1. So this is pretty much an expected board clear that will occur at some point in the game, so you need to always be thinking about this card and playing around the possibility. And then finally, the late game minions for the Warrior Control are pretty devastating. There are a lot of them, and they're big. Probably the most dangerous is Geddon, which I do not have, it looks like, who deals 2 damage to all their characters at the end of the turn. So this, of course, kills all your totems, as well as does a lot of damage. And he has 5 health, so usually requires multiple sources of damage to deal with. The other big minions are Cairn, is a common one, Ragnaros, Gromash, and Ysera. Oops, can't just type. And Alexstrasza. So there's a lot of big minions. Probably the second most that you'll face in against any deck other than Handlock. But I still think this matchup is pretty heavily favored for the Shaman. So for mulliganing, you generally want a form of spell damage, on-demand spell damage like Thalnos, plus a lightning bolt, or a wild pyro plus a early removal. And this is for dealing with one of those 4 health Frothing Berserkers early game. If you don't have one in a pinch, you can Earthshock a Frothing Berserker, but it's still, a 2/3 minion on the board, and they'll be able to do something like Cruel Taskmaster or whatever to give it more value. And then otherwise try to get Feral Spirits in combination with the buff cards like Flame Tongue, Argus, Unbound Elemental, and then you can get some early control of the board with those combinations, because this is a pretty slow matchup. So general tips, because this matchup is so slow, you want to play for board control at all times so that the opponent cannot get favorable trades. Again, they will try to use stuff like Cruel Taskmasters with some of their weaker minions, Armorsmith, Acolyte of Pain. We'll get card draw off it, all that good stuff. So try to clear their board so that they don't get more advantage than they're going to innately. Try to count the number of critical removal cards that they play. This is Shield Slam, Execute, and Brawl. And in conjunction with that, Shield Slam obviously uses their armor, so try to keep track at any given turn what the likelihood of their armor being the next turn is. So if they have 4 armor right now on your turn, assume they'll get up to 6 easily with just a hero power, and potentially even shield block to go up to 9 or so. So keep that in mind so that if they are going to Shield Slam, what you play on that turn, you're okay with losing it. So if you play a Fire Elemental and they have the potential to get 5 armor pretty easily, even without a shield block, be prepared to lose your Fire Elemental to a Shield Slam for 1 mana. So just something to keep in mind. Turn 7 is crucial because of that Baron Geddon as I mentioned. So I can't, there he is. Anyway, try to keep in mind when turn 7 is approaching that Baron Geddon could be dropped and play around it. This is similar to playing against the priest. Try to keep your minions at 3 or higher health because of this card around turn 7, if you can. As I mentioned, the number of late game threats for the warrior is quite high, so you want to use your removal spells wisely. And by this I mean kind of order the importance of their minions and then use your hexes based on that, as well as your other removals. So because you only have 2 hexes and probably the only other removal are these minor ones, I think the most important thing to hex is Ysera. The reason is that her health level, 12, is insane, and she will keep drawing cards if you don't deal with her right away. So she's always going to draw 1 dream card. But if you can hex her immediately, that eliminates the potential of a lot of disadvantage that you'd get. So try to save your hex for Ysera, first and foremost. Second would be Ragnaros. He's the next most difficult to deal with. And after that, you can kind of work down the threat level from there. Cairn can be hexed, particularly if he's played early on, especially if they coin him on 5 or something. It's okay to hex Cairn, because otherwise it's going to be really problematic to deal with him. However, if you can get away with saving a hex and using an Earthshock plus another card, it'll be a 2-for-1 for Cairn, but that's pretty much standard anyway. But that will allow you to save your hex for those Ysera or Rag cards later. And then finally, don't worry so much about the armor gains that the warrior will get. They will get a lot of armor. That's sort of the style. But truth be told, it doesn't matter that much. Outside of the 2 shield slams, which will occur at some point, all their armor does is delay their death. But because the warrior deck focuses so much on card draw, the warrior will always draw out or fatigue themselves before you do as a shaman. So if you just sustain your control of the game, keep it pretty even, play around their big minions, their brawls, deal with the removals, and then keep your hexes in control until you absolutely need to get rid of Ysera or Rag or whatever, you will eventually get advantage over them, and they won't have the removals to deal with your stuff, and you'll have enough smaller minions that they can't deal with it. So I think that about covers everything for this deck guide. Hopefully this is useful to a few people. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you have any suggestions or constructive criticism. And if you enjoyed, feel free to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.